contradictions in the colonial experience. Independence movements.
In the next part of this lecture, we're going to examine how Koreans participated in independence movements. So, obviously, while there were those who participated and they worked with the Japanese colonial administration, whether it being employed on the Japanese police force, being recruited as a Japanese imperial soldier, working in the Japanese colonial administration. There were others, Koreans, who fell on the opposite end of the spectrum and who were completely resistant to Japanese imperial rule and would resort to violent activities in order to get rid of the Japanese.
Which year was the Korean Provisional Government established?
Resistance movements against the Japanese occurred internally in Korea as well as externally. So they operated and organized within Korea, but because the police force was so powerful, many of these movements had to move outside of Korea. But the result is that, and this is yet another contradiction, the result is that because there is such a wide variety of colonial experiences for Koreans, meaning that there are those Koreans whose lives were actually benefited or improved during the colonial period, such as wealthy landowners or those who might have been involved in the development of industry. Those people have a net positive experience. And then on the other hand, there are those who were brutally oppressed, tortured, murdered, assassinated, and they have the opposite feeling of the colonial period. And so these very different colonial experiences, as well as everything in between on that spectrum, this ended up being extremely polarizing for Korean society post-liberation and even up until today. Looking at the history of resistance movements in Korea. Resistance movements moved outside of Korea to places like China, Manchuria, and Russia. Manchuria being relatively close, just across the river on the northern end of Korea, and China also being in close proximity. Russia going either up through Vladivostok or going into the main part of Russia. We have quite a few Koreans who relocated to these areas and were active in their independence movements from those places, such as the Righteous Armies. But because of where they ended up relocating, many of these independence fighters became exposed to communist ideology and found communist ideology extremely appealing because communism is anti-imperialist. So, for example, the myth of Kim Il-sung, which tries to establish his long line of activities as an independence fighter and as being anti-Japanese. The myth begins with Kim Il-sung going to Manchuria and fighting against the Japanese. He eventually moves over to Russia, where he becomes indoctrinated and properly educated in Marxist ideology and returns to Korea post-liberation. None of this can really be confirmed, but in any case, this mythology or this story is an attempt to try to create some amount of credibility for Kim Il-sung as this true nationalist and anti-Japanese imperialist fighter. The independence movement culminated with the March 1st movement in 1919. So on the eve of Ko Jung's funeral, because there was going to be a state funeral held on March 3rd, the independence activists decided to preempt this and hold an independence movement and declare the independence of Korea on March 1st. So they gathered, they read the Declaration of Independence, they were promptly arrested, but there were also coordinated events around the country where they also read the Declaration of Independence. This was a peaceful independence movement. All in all, over 1 million Koreans participated, and this is noteworthy because it is considered to be the first truly national event and event of Korean nationalism since young, old, men, women, people of all different social classes, people from all different religions or intellectual traditions participated in the March 1st movement. Unfortunately, the Japanese reaction was an overreaction, and they brutally suppressed those who participated in the March 1st movement. But the March 1st movement inspired those independence activists to establish an interim government in Shanghai. Because Korea was not a formal country, and because its government had been dissolved when it was colonized by Japan, it was not recognized as a nation state by the international community. So in order to re-establish its government, the Korean independence activists, they established an interim government in Shanghai. And this initially included everyone on the political right and the political left, but eventually came to be dominated by the political right. There were also resistance groups in the United States. For example, Syngman Rhee, who would go on to become the first president of the Republic of Korea, he was active and organized resistance groups in the US, and his idea was that the only way for Korea to regain its independence was through the help of a very strong foreign power like the United States. An Chang-ho, who was another independence activist, he believed, yes, we need to regain our independence, but the way that we can do this is by gradually educating and preparing ourselves. Pang Yong-man took a very different tact, and he said, no, the only way we can do this is through force. We need to develop our military and take it by force. If we look at Koreans throughout the empire, not just outside of Korea, but throughout the empire, we see that there were different Koreans who had moved to different parts of the Japanese empire for better opportunities. And so there were Koreans who lived in Japan, and if you were Korean living in Japan, you had to carry around a kind of booklet as identification, and which gave basic information on yourself, but still identified you as Korean. So as a means of establishing your identity, this one aspect of these kinds of identification booklets was that there was an oath printed inside, an oath for subjects of the imperial nation, and member responsibilities. So although you were a Japanese imperial subject, and although you were constantly reminded of your duties to the Japanese Empire, another contradiction was that Korean subjects received very little rights in terms of civil rights or political rights or voting rights. But over the years, Koreans spread throughout the Japanese Empire. Here we see a picture of Koreans in Kyushu. And Kyushu is not that far from Korea, but we see them making a life for themselves there. There are also many Korean laborers who moved to the South Pacific. As Japan expanded its empire into the South Pacific, so too Korean laborers went with them. And then, of course, after Japan started to occupy Manchuria, either there were Koreans who moved up to Manchuria to find work in the factories there, or after 1937 and with the full-time war mobilization effort, the Japanese colonial government then moved forcefully workers into these areas as forced labor. Independence movements still continued, and many of them were operating from areas like Manchuria, but because as the Japanese imperial government and empire became increasingly more militaristic, it was difficult to fight against them. This is particularly true after Japan's victory in the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937. So between 1930 to 1940, with this mobilization, we can see from this graph that there was quite a bit of population movement within the Japanese Empire. There were about 1.3 million workers that moved abroad, so 700,000 moving to Japan and 600,000 to Manchuria. And it's a little bit of a misconception to say that they moved abroad, because in fact they were just moving to different parts of the Japanese Empire. After 1939, though, this is when Japan starts implementing compulsory labor and forcing Koreans to move to different parts of the empire for the wartime effort. And during this time, about 750,000 were moved and forced into industrial labor, and about 250,000 as civilian personnel. So we can see that as a result that this continues until Japan's surrender in 1945. And so the very tight grip that the Japanese Empire had during the wartime years was extremely strict and oppressive and brutal, and Koreans felt that they had no choices and no will of their own. As mentioned, though, because there is a spectrum of experiences during the colonial period, we have those who did quite well for themselves. These are landlords and capitalists and white-collar professionals. And then on the other end of the spectrum, there are those who suffered greatly, such as tenant farmers and factory wage workers and landless peasants. And then we have in between all the different experiences in the middle of that spectrum. But because there's such a wide variety, this is what has then fed into the contradictory nature of the colonial experience and the polarization in views of the colonial experience. So by the time Korea was liberated from colonial rule, we have various national groups, those on the right who were propertied, educated, who had cooperated with the colonial administration, had been resistant to fundamental social change, or even participated on the colonial police force. And then on the political left, we have those such as intellectuals, students, peasants, workers, who sought redistribution of wealth and dramatic social change. There is this vast difference and polarization, as well as for those on the left, those who are radicalized by the colonial experience. And the question then becomes, how do we unify all of these people?
These are the keywords for this class. Independence movements, March First Movement, Provisional Government, World War, Radicalization.